All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for showing up. I know yesterday was a long day, didn't end for those of you who stuck around till after 10. So we appreciate your coming out this morning, and I also know there are a lot of other workshops, so it's great to have you all here. The theme for this workshop is intersectional analysis of gender-based violence. Gender-based violence has been a theme that's come up over the last 2 days in the plenaries as well as several of the workshop sessions. So I'm excited today to see how we can build on what's been the groundwork that's been laid already and where we can go with that. We have 3 fabulous speakers with us. I'll introduce them all to you and then they will begin their presentations. So first we have Vec Lewis, who teaches contemporary Latin American popular culture, as well as courses in Latino-Latina studies, critical theory, and social research at the University of Sydney, Australia. He's come all the way from Australia to be with us, so big round of applause for that.
Thank you.
And at the University of Sydney, he is a lecturer and chair of the Department of Spanish and Latin American Studies. He's the author of Crossing Sex and Gender in Latin America and has published work in Portal, Sexualities, and in several books. His current work involves ethnographic field research around questions of migration, cultural identity, legal systems, and sexual minorities in Mexico and Australia. Our second speaker will be Elizabeth Philippos. She is an associate professor of women's studies at California State University, Long Beach. Her teaching and research interests are in critical race and feminist theory, colonial history, international law, sexuality, militarist cultures, and the role of emotions in global politics. Her articles have appeared in several journals as well as edited collections on feminism and war. And our third speaker is Jacqueline Dan, who is a third-year law student here at UCLA, and she's in the Critical Race Studies program. Her work focuses on Asian Americans and the law, including immigration issues, civil rights, and other issues. Her paper today grows out of the work that she did in Professor Crenshaw's Intersectionality seminar. So with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Okay, thanks for coming. Thanks for braving the early morning hours, and given that this is the last day of this amazing conference, it's pretty heavy going when one gets this involved. But of course, we've got a lot in store today. And I'm very happy to be here and be part of this. Now, I have a few technical challenges because I've timed my slides and I'm hoping that they'll just do their work on their own. And it looks like they have, but I have to start again. So let's just go with that. All right, so what you're going to be seeing on the screen, you can look at that if you don't want to look at me, a series of kind of abstracted cases of violence against travestis in Latin American contexts. Now, when I use the word travesti, there's some slippage that's used between travesti and transgender, but there's also some very culturally specific aspects to both the lived experiences, the identity terrains, and also the social locations of travestis within Latin American contexts, which are important to bear in mind. So occasionally I'll use the word trans, which is also a word that exists in Spanish and Portuguese, but I would like to make that distinction just to begin with, referring to the work of the Argentinian scholars Mauro Cabral and Paula Vituro, who talk about travestis as being persons who, having been assigned the masculine gender at birth, identify themselves in different versions of femininity and who may or may not surgically or hormonally modify their bodies. Their identities are very strongly associated with involvement in sexual labour. Now, this is also something that becomes tricky representationally, but is an important thing to bear in mind when we think about their social locations. Okay, so initially you'll see some of these cases coming up that kind of frame things in a countrywide basis. And I obviously can't do due to, you know, all the eccentricities of both national and geopolitical locations and the more state and municipal levels, although that is the substance really of the kind of analysis that I want to make here. Looking at these cases, we can see a variety of textures, not all of which are perhaps immediately visible. But of course, one of the questions that might be asked is, from these instances of aggression and violence, which would seem to be seemingly random, how might we frame and explain them? How might the agents and forces be revealed? Most commonly, the concept employed is transphobia, which has become quite extensive in work on violence against what I'm calling, in very generalized ways, trans subjects in different locales. Transphobia in Spanish and Portuguese. And this term is used obviously by people who are working in solidarity efforts across national borders, but also by activists within their particular regional and national locations, especially those that feel that it's very difficult to frame the kinds of incidences of discrimination and violence without recourse, at least to some kind of internationalizing discourse around this experience of discrimination and subordination. So what is transphobia? Well, according to Talia May Becher, transphobia refers not only to, quote, the fear of trans people, but simply any negative attitudes, hatred, loathing or rage harboured toward trans people on the basis of our enactments of gender. Transphobia as an analytic concept has been employed in critical theory and in activist circles to account for a broad range of exclusions and forms of social erasure, including discrimination in the workplace, in education and in the health and social services sectors. Whether used in the cultural sense as an expression of moral belief or prejudice, or to describe the institutionally regulated experience of marginalisation, both aspects of the concept rely on the category of gender as a baseline to make intelligible acts and relations that range from the extremes of murder and violence to the everyday microaggressions of a coercive normative order. So all over the world, increasingly the judgment is that abuses and violations like these pinpointed in the country by country cases you've seen, they've now disappeared, I apologise for that, but affect transgender people who are targeted for harassment and violence on the basis of their gender. On this basis, one would rule that the circumstances that travestis and transsexuales face in Latin America are all predicated on negative attitudes or bigotry, which becomes manifest in aggressions exacted upon them by virtue of their gender expressions. I choose to focus on Latin America, obviously because I work within Latin American studies, but also because of its continued prominent place in commentaries like the Remembering Our Dead website. I don't know how many people might be familiar with that, but it's a website that contains lists of transgender persons in the United States and worldwide who have been murdered. Now, regardless of the perpetrator or socio-political context, the assumption is that transphobia can universally and uniformly describe the subordination and domination that the mentioned violence embodies, and that these conditions are the same faced by all trans people everywhere, regardless of differences in national, linguistic, juridical, cultural, economic and geopolitical locations. The gender-based interpretation of the subordination and aggression described by transphobia has, of course, been subject to increasing critique. Part of that critique involves an interrogation of the kinds of manoeuvres that are posited to lie at the heart of the, for instance, Remembering Our Dead website and the associated day of commemoration held in North America on November 20 each year, the Transgender Day of Remembrance. The Remembering Our Dead website states that it aims to honour, quote, those killed due to transgender-based hate or prejudice, regardless of any other factors in their lives. The accusation of reductionism has been levelled at both the gender-based account of subordination and aggression offered by popularised versions of transphobia and the commemorative gestures of recounting the deaths attributed to it. But most fruitfully, an intersectional view has been advanced to reframe transphobic violence with reference to specific hate crimes and the statistics collected in the US high-profile murder cases and also their representational treatment, and also via certain interesting empirical work that has been done on the lived experiences, particularly of trans people of colour. So this work is really interesting, and I'm not going to have time to give it its due, really, but I would point to a certain number of works. Okay, my main aim in the course of the presentation, really speaking, is not simply to rethink transphobia via an intersectional lens. Rather, it is to extend the inter- and intra-categorical critical reworkings of trans experiences of subordination, to bring in the contextual, to insist on the situational, not merely in reference to lived forms of multiply constituted identity-based exclusion, but also the social, political, legal and economic processes that inform them. I hold that although there may be transnational resonances that link the experiences of differently situated trans women and men across geopolitical spaces, the second level of reductionism that requires analysis also is what I'm terming the myth of trans equivalence, which is in part based on the first reductive manoeuvre that frames gender as the focus that gives the fullest explicatory power to understand acts of violence and discrimination, and which seemingly unites victims across space and time. Now, I think that such logic is quite dangerous, because how are we to usefully intervene in settings that are not understood in their particularity, which is a conversation that goes on a lot when we talk about intersectionality and even post-intersectionality, dare I say. Now, to close, I'll offer a few reflections on how the concept of transphobia might be grounded once such reductionisms are overcome and the complexity that is required is brought to bear on accounting for the conditions that produce discrimination and violence. Okay, so that's a rather long introduction. The critiques and of the approach that privileges gender via an intersectional lens, well, basically scholars ask this really essential question: what are the limits of the concept transphobia as it is commonly used? What does it allow us to see and not to see? Critical activists and diverse scholars have worked from the basis of this series of questions to provide a richer, more situated account of forms of discrimination and violence, particularly reference to the framework of hate crimes in Australian, Canadian and US context. Now, within the context of Sydney, and I'm not going to get patriotic on you all or anything like that, I'm actually not from Sydney, but I live there. There was a study done, two studies actually, by Leslie Moran and Andrew Sharp, who basically really pick apart, you know, this one kind of axis account of violence that popularised notions of transphobia that could kind of offer. Now, they argue that the almost exclusive focus on transgender status found in anti-hate crimes activism can result in an erasure of nuances, alighting the significance, quote, of a variety of other factors such as age, ethnicity, sexuality and class. Transgender activists commonly frame discrimination and violence faced by their peers via the axis of gender. Of course, this is not counterintuitive as such, since much lived experience and anecdotal evidence points to harassment and attacks having a basis to an important degree in the targeting of perceived gender atypical expression. However, this account is not sufficient and potentially deleterious to efforts to combat such violence, especially given that, in the United States at least, a large quantity, indeed the majority, of gender variant persons who experience victimisation are persons of colour. Now, they're working from the context of Sydney, so it has some different nuances within the context of Sydney as well. They look at the way in which different geographical locations also affect people's experiences of violence in terms of what is expected in differing socioeconomic contexts and also ethnic contexts vis-a-vis how one should embody one's masculinity or femininity and how those things can change in different socioeconomic contexts. Another point that they raise in their second study, well, they interviewed a range of subjects in Sydney. Most of them were white male to female transsexuals. There were two female to male trans men and one sister girl. And sister girl is a term that's used in the Indigenous community It doesn't necessarily ascribe to transgender, but it embodies an experience which is both kind of an understanding of sexuality and also a kind of feminine gender. Yeah? And the contrasts between the subjects that they interviewed were really interesting because one of the women had said, well, you know, I'm trans and I'm also a lesbian, but those things stand apart. So when I suffer discrimination, it's because I'm transgender, it's never because I'm a lesbian. And she was very clear about that. Now, when the sister girl was asked about what her experiences of violence were like, she said, well, you know, that's a really hard question to answer because I get a lot of violence and discrimination all over the shop. And I have to say, you know, that sometimes I can't tell the difference because when someone insults me or abuses me, they're also like having a go at me for being Aboriginal and also for being a sister girl. So, you know, it's really interesting to look at that study because not only are they drawing on an intersectional approach, but they, you know, in their very data, they produce some very interesting kinds of ways to rethink through the intersectional lens. Here in LA, you might be aware of a study by Rebecca Stotzer. Has anyone come across that? Anyway, she kind of looks at the problem of actually moving beyond a mere one-axis account of transphobia, which is kind of ironically compounded by the fact that, like, for instance, police data doesn't even contain particulars. You know, when people even make reports about, say, the race of the perpetrator, their sex, the context, the location in which it happened, things like that, as well as even the person who's doing the reporting. And so it's really hard to be able to make this kind of tracking. Yeah? But she found statistics that actually came out of the LA County Commission on Human Relations, which did provide, minimally, but did provide some of those aspects. And on that basis, she really asked questions about, you know, to what extent locations, socioeconomic status of both victim and perpetrator, race elements of the violence. For instance, the large majority of those that were subject to violence within LA, particularly in South LA, were African Americans. But you also sort of found Latino and Latino violence and Latino and black violence. She speculates that some of that violence came about, not strictly speaking because of, you know, the gender kind of expression kind of targeting, but that, you know, it has to be seen within the context of, for instance, certain gangs, yeah, that target populations and that sort of say, you know, this is an initiation rite, okay, we're going to pick on a black person here and we're going to pick a transgender woman because that's an easy target. And so in that case, it's really hard, according to that particular speculation, it's hard to separate gender from race. All right, so how am I going for time?
You still have, you're good.
Oh, good.
Halfway.
All right, so moving on a little bit, and I've really, you know, glossed there, so please look at their studies. Vivian Namaste has challenged the primacy of gender in accounting for acts of violence and the murder of transsexual women, particularly those counted as victims of anti-trans hatred and prejudice, such as the deaths cited on the Remembering Our Dead website. Rather than the violation of sex-gender norms being at the root of many anti-trans violence cases, murders of transsexual women can be shown as having more in common the fact that such people have become victims of anti-sex worker attacks. Being involved in street sex work becomes a condition of visibility in which not all trans women are necessarily implicated. Now, another study says that those particular TG and TS women like the canaries in the coal mine for all TS and TG women, which I think is quite sus. But anyway, the stark simplicity of the Remembering Our Dead website and the reiterative power in the name of opposing gender violence produced by the Day of Remembrance doesn't really encourage a deeper analysis of the circumstances, such as those that I've begun to trace with these particular studies, that lead to the deaths of persons so commemorated. Instead, as Sarah Lamble purports, quote, transgender bodies are universalised along a singular identity plane of victimhood, wherein the specific relations of power that give rise to acts of violence are disappeared. Time and place are lost, as are the informing dimensions of race, class and sexuality. Moreover, this decontextualization suggests that the murders recorded in the website are based on individual hatred instead of, quote, the accumulative effect of legal, political and economic institutions founded on hierarchies of power. So this moves me to Latin America, thinking intersectionally and situationally, a ground view. And this is just a beginning. The downsizing to the individual, whether via the via the isolation of an act or by explanations that only work on one identity axis, can be ameliorated by an intersectional approach to transphobia. In the case of travestis in Latin America, one is forced to think intersectionally almost straight away, and even without calling it that. Because, you know, I kind of gave myself this little challenge. I'm going to look up intersectionality and see what comes up. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't a lot, yeah. But that doesn't mean that people aren't making these kinds of analyses. Indeed, when we think about travestis, such subjects are immediately visible for their multiply constituted social locations that traverse sexuality, gender, class, race, ethnicity, as several ethnographic studies demonstrate. A note of caution is in order, however. Given historical and present-day socio-cultural differences between here, and here I'm referring, given that I'm in the US, to the US, and there, Latin America, I hate that opposition, by the way, but anyway. Such categories are not self-evidently congruent or operationally the same. While intersectionality may help to illuminate the historic and contemporary co-articulations of race, sexuality, race, class, gender and sexuality in Latin America, and indeed there are co-articulations, each of these categories is culturally differently constituted, and even within the region. Yeah. To give some examples, race is not intelligible via a black-white framework necessarily, and gender is understood in remarkably different ways. Indeed, the word género, translation from English, and used in feminist circles perhaps, is not necessarily even understood on the street. It sounds like you're talking about a type of film or a piece of cloth. Género, John, you know, type. It doesn't necessarily resonate for people. Okay, so the other thing is that race is often buried in class, in a complex system of social hierarchization, and also with some references to sort of phenotypical somatic features, but it's a lot more fluid, really, than a typical kind of, and I believe that in many contexts this is true as well, a black and white framework, yeah? Okay, so needless to say, I'm okay?
2.
How many minutes?
2.
Oh, shit. Needless to say, however, travestis are immersed in a collision of outsider categories, categories not easily separated either analytically nor within their life trajectories. They share, for instance, with other subjects of their ethnicity and or social class, precarious forms of insertion within informal, non-prestigious forms of labour, as well as an exposure to continual forms of surveillance and regulation. Now, I want to pause for a moment, even though I don't have time, to summarise in a really general way some of the directions that I'm talking about, some of the distinctions for Latin American travestis that must be factored in to avoid an uncritical application of transphobia to their conditions of marginalisation and violence. Now, I've already spoken of the reductionism at the heart of a gender-only account of such interpretations of violence and hate crimes in Anglophone contexts. Of course, it's also necessary to navigate the presumption of trans-equivalence that I mentioned at the beginning when we think systemically about the locations of these subjects. Some distinctions are hence in order. In Latin America, cases of what might be called hate crimes, violence and discrimination can be much more clearly referenced to fears around HIV, public health and security. That deserves a lot of unpacking, but I'm just signaling that. Travestis are clearly referenced in public discourse as transgressors of morality, as criminal maldoers, and as, quote, carriers of HIV. They are associated with prostitution. In fact, travesti is almost a synonym of prostitute. Travesti gender expression is hence not separated from questions of sexuality, and although there are transsexuals and transgender identified persons who do not work in sexual labour and who vigorously distance themselves from any association with sex work or other criminalised behaviours, a large portion of male to female trans people and travestis earn their living by public sex work. In Buenos Aires, a study was done by Berkins and Fernandez that showed that 79% of the 302 travestis and transgender women that they interviewed in Buenos Aires and Mar del Plata worked principally as prostitutes, and this is not uncommon in other urban locales in Latin America. Travesti is seen as a version of homosexual, the street queen. In the public mind, a more degraded version of homosexuality, and here I'm drawing on a range of Brazilian research. They're often implicated in a matrix of laws that reference public order and morality. Some of these legal codes have been around for over a century, and yet some are being newly and more specifically promulgated aimed at travestis in terms of sexual display, referencing sex work, and also cross-dressing. So, just to kind of bring us to the end, or the beginning, there are some major differences. When we have to think about gender violence in the context of travestis in Latin American locales, it's impossible not to think of gender orders and social orders. Deborah Castillo notes that while the focus on the individual, almost random violence seems to be characteristic in many studies advanced on anti-trans violence in the United States, Mexican studies, in contrast, focus repeatedly on violence committed against trans by authorities, providing an institutional account of these actions. Now, there are recent studies here in the US that also do that. For instance, I can mention Dean Spade and Gehi and several other people who have published work in recent years. What is patently the case is that in Latin American instances, the way in which transphobic violence is enmeshed in the very systems of power that Lamble referred, that I referred to earlier, is just the primary issue, right? Significant social, political, legal and economic processes need to be emphasised. Violent attacks and murders, whether by authorities, which is the dominant scenario, or what I would call other interest groups, are just the tip of the iceberg of relations of violence and domination. The socio-economic and political panorama that is both an expression and a reinforcer of the systemic production of the subordination that travestis, among other subjects, face includes the urban violence panoramas of Latin American cities, the criminalisation of poverty, the unruly and selective rule of law in decentralised nation states, and the punitive politics of public security, all in the context of the polarising effects of neoliberal democratisation in Latin America. And maybe just to sort of finish up on this note, I would have to say that in spite of this talk about democratisation, especially in the 1990s, accompanied, surprisingly, by neoliberalisation, not exclusively in the 1990s, but this talk about, greater spaces for civil society and greater sort of social freedoms, this period in the 1990s, and this makes some kind of transnational connection, sees the emergence of a range of formidable public security laws. And if in totalitarian regimes in Latin American locales, various groups were targeted as being political subversives, for instance, associated with leftist guerrilla, these days the perceived enemy is the civilian, and not just any civilian. So those that enjoyed the democratisation are those that have a particular class location. And those that don't, pointedly those that are within public spaces, which are contested over by a range of interests, including the authorities and including private interests that I haven't had the chance to go into, backed up by a legal system that brings in public security laws, are the target. So in asking these questions, I'm fundamentally wanting to ground analysis of transphobia, if it's to be used across geopolitical locations. We can make the return here easily in many ways too, because there are resonances. I don't want to say that there is no way of, activating across borders. But it requires that degree of complexity and thoroughgoing thinking, and I've only just started to scratch the surface. But I hope that we can engage in a fruitful discussion to further that and get some insights from some of you guys and so on. Yeah? Thank you.
Terrific, thanks.
Good morning. This presentation I'm doing is from a paper that was published last year in a book called Theorizing Sexual Violence, and I'm just developing a couple of new concepts to expand the theoretical framework. And this is about, this work is on the international laws of war governing sexual violence. And I started working on this as a PhD student, and found that there were a lot of questions I couldn't answer. As I guess as a PhD student, there's a lot of questions we can't answer. But it's taken me a while to figure out that my questions were all really answered by colonial history and by putting international law in a context of colonial history. And so that's what I'm doing in this project. So this project investigates the discursive terrain that constructs the spectacular violence of rape and sexual violence in armed conflict in international human rights and humanitarian law discussions, and especially since the 1990s and the wars in the former Yugoslavia, there's a global consciousness that women are targeted in war and by militarist cultures, and several institutions have been created that enshrine that recognition. And I'll just say that that was knowledge that feminists have had for decades and decades. It's just that in the 90s, international human rights law really acknowledged that. But at the same time that there's a global consciousness about women's status in war, a superficial glance at the regions and peoples who are most often held accountable for their violent crimes against women indicate that it's non-Euro descended peoples, people of color. The cases under investigation by the International Criminal Court include the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Central African Republic, and Darfur. The exception of the ad hoc tribunal for the former Yugoslavia draws our attention to the ways that race is a social construction enacted to serve particular political ends, and in this instance drawing a post-communist region into a capitalist global order. So while the whole story can't be told on the basis of a superficial glance, the discourse of sexual violence against women in war is suspect as an instance of a consciousness about the spectacular violence committed by peoples who are constructed as uncivilized, where sexuality is the racializing factor, constructing primitive, culture-bound, and static others in need of being civilized. And I say this in part in the post-Cold War period. There's been a very selective implementation of law in militarized zones. And so there's very little attention, public attention, media, or human rights attention to the sexual violence committed by U.S. soldiers against U.S. soldiers. There's very little attention paid to U.S. soldiers' treatment of women in Iraq under the occupation. There's very little attention paid to Western peacekeeping missions over many years that are generally accompanied by violence and violations against women, or a particularly egregious example of French soldiers in Rwanda post-genocide who sought out women to sexually violate them as part of the terrain of peacekeeping. So there's various ways to explain why these occurrences don't become part of international human rights law conversations. And as Talal Assad says, there's a banal fact that powerful states are never held accountable to such institutions, that only the weak and defeated can be convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So this banal fact redirects my attention from the urgent sense that law must be used to stop crimes against women to more structural concerns about the purpose and function of concepts such as war crimes and crimes against humanity in maintaining a global hierarchy between socially produced races and nations, and the function of international legal systems as they've been constituted in a radically unequal global system since at least the 1600s. And so in the case of sexual violence against women in war, the well-being and security of women is used as grounds for maintaining global hierarchies and the global color line. So there's several things at stake in this analysis. The first thing that's at stake is the persistently uneven application of international laws governing violence, which hold non-European and racialized accountable while granting relative immunity to Euro-American perpetrators. Two is the narrative framing of the perpetrators and the crimes themselves through implicit and explicit colonial tropes. Three is the imperial and racial purposes served by the circulation of rape stories from armed conflict zones, and which echo colonial history rape stories that Jenny Sharp has documented very nicely in the case of India. And the fourth is the governance and administration of the sexuality of those deemed inferior. So my argument is indebted to the insights of Anne Orford, who suggests that at the heart of international law is a civilizing mission that aims to incorporate and assimilate peoples and nations to what is presumed to be or projected as a Euro-American standard of civilization that carries with it racial, sexual, religious, and gendered connotations. So in the course of pursuing the prosecution of rape and sexual violence, international laws governing war rely upon the politicization of women's bodies as members of ethnic, racial, or national groups, and as victims requiring protection in war zones. And women are rendered spaces to be protected through ethnic categories and racial categories in the same way that other post-war stabilization practices rely on ethnic distinctions. So territorial divisions along ethnic designations that are patrolled by peacekeeping forces is a very standard post-war practice. The institution of new techniques of managing populations, from refugee relocations to legislating minority group representation in government, to documenting births, deaths, and border crossings according to ethnicity. So as a mechanism of post-war stabilization, international war crimes tribunals prosecute crimes of sexual violence in and through ethnic and national designations of populations. In effect, they contain and regulate sexual relations and sexuality, and they racialize populations on the grounds of their sexual conduct. And all of this echoes the colonial practices upon which international law is founded. There's a further problem in the selective application of international law to only those considered to be other to international law. Is what we get is a grand archive of cases that are based only on the violence of the other, only framed in terms of racial and colonial terms. And so in law, as practitioners, for lawyers, this is case law, this is precedent, and this is what they draw on, right, to develop other legislation. As researchers, it's knowledge, and there's a politics of knowledge in that production of that archive. And so the knowledge is also in the service of maintaining a certain understanding of us as civilized and sexually appropriate, and them as those who need to be governed along the lines of their sexuality and sexual deviance. Okay, so two concepts that are relevant to this theoretical framework. So one is, I'm drawing from Jackie Alexander's book, Pedagogies of Crossing, the concept of the palimpsest of imperialism. And the palimpsest of imperialism in her book is she looks at the multiple layers of imperial order that are both within the U.S. as an internal imperialism of racialized populations, and U.S. foreign policy and its imperialism abroad. I'm using the palimpsest of imperialism to think about the multiple layers of imperial history that are embedded within international law that create this kind of foundation that have implicit assumptions about the colonial or racialized other and the appropriate ways that power should operate, right? The second concept that I'm drawing on is the coloniality of power, and this is something that's developed by Annabelle Chiano and Walter Mignolo, mainly in their studies of Latin America, and Maria Lugones, who is taking that concept and combining it with intersectionality and doing very interesting things. So Maria Lugones tells us that the coloniality of power introduces the basic and universal social classification of the population of the planet in terms of the idea of race. The invention of race is a pivotal turn as it replaces the relations of superiority and inferiority established through domination. It reconceives humanity and human relations fictionally in biological terms, and it replaces what used to be Eurocentric theories of social classes. She tells us it makes conceptual room for the centrality of the classification of the world's population in terms of races in the understanding of global capitalism. She also tells us that coloniality does not just refer to racial classification. It's an encompassing phenomenon since it is one of the axes of the system of power, and as such it permeates all control of sexual access, collective authority, labor, subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and the production of knowledge from within these intersubjective relations. So Maria Lugones' sort of addition or contribution or expansion of this idea of coloniality of power is to really put together sexual relations with race, that these are inseparable ideas and intersecting in all sorts of ways. So in terms of the palimpsest of imperialism, then I have many layers, and I'm not going to tell them all, but drawing from Carl Schmitt, he argues that, or shows us, that the regime of international law constructed by European powers came in 1492 with the discovery of the Americas and 1500 with circumnavigation. And the idea of an emergent planetary consciousness, a consciousness amongst Europeans that we live in one world, that gave rise to the need for international law because it gave rise to the problem of creating order if it's one world. And so international law derived at its inception from European interests and traditions, a set of ordering principles for the globe that from its inception established the right of land appropriation and legal categories like conquest and war and discovery. And it was designed to adjudicate European territorial disputes. So this is a 1492 paradigm of international law in which we operate today. I can say another layer of international law is around the codification of the laws of war. And this is the Hague Conventions in 1899 are seen to be a major codification. These conventions came at the end of the Hague Conferences, seem to be important events in the consolidation of European solidarity and a shared commitment to grapple with the problem of violence between armies of civilized nations. And all the language of civilization and humanity refer to Europeans and European values. But the Hague Conventions came at the end of what's known as the scramble for Africa, the 20-year violent invasion of Africa that transformed Africa into colonies. So this codification of humanitarian law in the context of the scramble for Africa meant that colonial violence was not taken as something that was prohibited, and natives or savages, which are named in international law as such, were not subject to the protections of humanitarian law. And so colonial wars and colonial occupations were seen more as law maintenance and pacification rather than actual war. And so there were no protections afforded to them. Another layer in this palimpsest, then, is this transnational consciousness of whiteness that started to develop around the 19th century, the 1800s. that united disparate and diverse regions of the world, marked by a global ascendance of whiteness and the self-conscious alliance between Euro-descended peoples throughout Dominion countries. And here I'm drawing on the historians Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds drawing the global color line, where they do a number of case studies that demonstrate that creation of a transnational community of white men. And they start from the observation of W.E.B. Du Bois' 1910 essay, The Soul of White Folk. So people understood a lot of resistance, right, to colonial struggles and independence struggles in a way that consolidated a self-conscious sense of white solidarity. So international law is developing in this context, and there's a number of other layers I could tell you about, but I'll just say that international law is a colonial enterprise, and colonialism itself is a thoroughly juridical enterprise. It's a law-based enterprise. And we still have laws that are about land appropriation that are still held to be legal, for instance. So, within international law, then, is a modern conception of the human, right, and a modern conception of races, and a modern conception of advancement and backwardness, or civilization and backwardness. And so within the universe of colonial logic, measuring backwardness is predicated on gendered and sexualized concepts of what it means to be human, self-determining, sovereign, and civilized. And so there are ways, and this is through the work of Helen Kinsella, who shows that nations and men are distinguished according to a social hierarchy of reason, judgment, comportment, and containment of sexual appetite that indexes both barbarity and the capacity of men to be self-governing. In turn, the modern conception of sexuality is a Euro-colonial construct that is central to national and racial preoccupations about lineage, inheritance, and blood. And so historical and contingent racial projects are conceived of as biological projects. So if the modern concept of race is a biological category, then family reproduction and kinship become integral to racial thinking, and gender and sexuality are central considerations. Women's sexuality and reproduction need to be governed so that lineage can be protected, and male sexuality comes to be identified as a site of potential racial violence and a threat to order, civilization, or the nation. And this is informed through the patriarchal assumption that lineage is passed through the male alone and through a preoccupation with procreative heterosexuality, so an appropriate heterosexuality. So lineage, white supremacy, the purity of the race, these are all at stake in these discussions. And so fear of miscegenation, cultural or racial pollution, etc., were at stake as well. And so demographic anxieties, the need to expand imperial races, to challenge imperial rivalries, and to maintain imperial rule over colonized peoples, all revolved around narratives about women's bodies and femininity that is politicized by imperial and national preoccupations with consolidating power through the management of population. Okay, so this is some of the theoretical framework, and let me just skip a whole bunch of stuff and tell you a bit about a case where some of these things come together. Okay, I'm going to take a little longer, I think, but not too much longer. Okay. Okay, so how does this work, right? In contemporary international law, there's a number of ways. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which I'll call the ICTY, made a decision in a landmark case in the prosecution of mass rape as a crime against humanity, and this was the case known as Kunarich. The crimes were committed in around the city of Foča in 1992 when the Bosnian Muslim majority city was taken by Serb forces and Bosnian Muslims were expelled, murdered, or taken to detention centers in the area. And this was a massive expulsion. The population of Bosnian Muslims went from 22,000 in the area to a post-war population of 10 individuals who were left in the area. So this was a massive expulsion. The ICTY found the men to be guilty of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this is the first case that had a singular focus on violations against women. It's the first case to successfully prosecute rape as a crime against humanity. And together with the Rwanda Tribunal case of rape as an act of genocide, elevate rape and sexual violence to the most egregious violations of humanitarian law. And so for feminist advocates, this is elevating the status of women to fully human if they're subject to the most egregious violence and redress for that. One of the important developments in the case against Kuneric is that an appeals chamber found an appeals chamber made a decision about the relevance of a woman's consent. And women's consent in rape law is a sort of central preoccupation. They had to decide this in Kuneric because the defense argued that the women had consented to sexual relations, and so you couldn't charge rape. Okay? A number of issues arise. In a context of war, this is by definition a context of coercion. And if a woman is being forcibly held in a detention center, on what grounds could she give consent to sexual relations, right? On the other hand, a war is not only a context of coercion. That is, it's possible to imagine many kinds of relationships that occur within a territory and within a time period known as war that may not constitute coercive relationships. And certainly in this region there were many multi-ethnic marriages and multi-ethnic relationships. Yeah. We could say further that in a context of coercion, a woman could consent to sexual relations in exchange for security or freedom or some other potential relative benefit. And this logic follows from the idea that women are agentic. Women are act, though not within conditions of their choosing. And so there is a way that we could think about agency in this case. However, the appeals chamber determined that the issue of consent was not relevant, it was meaningless in the circumstances of Foča that included the enslavement of women, psychological control, cruel treatment, forced labor, etc. So they ruled against the idea that consent could matter. Now within the way that the tribunal works, it has jurisdictional parameters about the geography and the time period, and it's also founded on the idea that there are ethnic identities in conflict, right? That it's a war, or the tribunal exists to adjudicate crimes committed between ethnic communities. They're called ethnic wars, right? And so the idea is that there are Serbs, Muslims, and Croats in the region, that all sides committed crimes, even though it was also agreed that the Serbs were aggressive in most areas. And the belligerents and the victims are always characterized through ethnic designations. They can't be anything else, right? If there's a violence committed by a Serb man against a Serb woman within the jurisdiction of the tribunal, they wouldn't necessarily be justiciable because there's domestic law that deals with that kind of violence. The International Tribunal is set up to adjudicate wars between designated parties, right? So what does this mean, right? What does this mean? One thing it means is that the ICTY will not hear cases of same ethnicity violence, intra-ethnicity violence, okay? Serb violence against Serbs or Croatian violence against Croatians, etc. However, right, with this ruling on consent, in the context of the jurisdiction of the tribunal, what is an implication is that any manner of sexual relations, coerced or consensual, committed by a Serbian soldier against a Bosnian Muslim civilian woman, or committed with a Bosnian Muslim civilian woman, is constituted as a crime under the ICTY's jurisdiction. This means that this focus on ethnic, racial, or national identities means that what they're legislating now is inter-ethnic sex, right? In other words, these are anti-miscegenation ideas, right? And this is iconic of any kind of racial governance. I don't think the ICTY aims to make all consensual relations between Serbs and Muslims illegal, right? I think this is a consequence of racial thinking, right? And it's the racial thinking that has constituted international law through this colonial history that plays out in these odd and disturbing ways. I think it's disturbing that it happens like this. So there's other cases. The Akaisu case in the Rwanda tribunal also revolves around warring ethnic parties, designated as ethnic parties. And in that case, consent was never decided. It's just assumed that there cannot be consensual relations between people who are not of the same ethnicity. So the subjects of the laws of war are not just any gendered bodies. These are bodies that are racialized through colonial and global structures of power. And they're racialized, again, as victims and agents of exceptionally deviant and perverted violent sexuality through the colonial tropes and racial grammars of international laws governing war. International law racializes these bodies to be brought into modernity as subject peoples, as second-tier sovereign subjects, triggering a regime of governance and management that revolves around sexual deviance and crime. These result in prohibitions on sexual relations between people who are not of the same ethnicity, and you see just many, many ways that that plays out. Okay, you can see how many pages I'm skipping here, right? Okay. One of the sort of reasons that I wanted to think about this more is because since I started working on international laws governing violence against women, I've always found it problematic that in a context of war, we're going to start parsing out what's legal, what's legitimate, what's possible. War is a context of violence, and it's not a place where law doesn't exist. In fact, it is a law-saturated zone, right? And it's law that makes these kinds of wars even possible, right? So what I want to suggest is that through our feminist thinking, that what we want to aim to do, what I want to aim to do, is not try and solve the problems of this paradigm, of this 1492 paradigm, through the mechanisms of this paradigm. Instead, I think we need to shift to the next paradigm of human relations, that takes apart and decolonizes these systems of law and these systems of global power that set people up in these ways to seemingly continuously be in states of violence. Thank you.
You need the mouse? Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, you have to get rid of mine.
Oh, it's all right. It's just right there. Okay. I'm going to do this backwards. Play. Is there a play? Am I close to the play button slideshow? Is this? Oh, no.
Yeah.
No. Oh, no, this is fine. No worries. I think I'm good.
Because I can't see.
Oh, you can't see? Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? This is good, this is good, this is good. Okay. So my proposal examines racialized gender-based violence against Asian American women, focusing on the value of organizing Asian American women to push for recognition of this form of violence as hate violence, and also for prosecutions under the recently enacted Federal Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Is this? Okay, here we go. As a starting point, I wanted to discuss public discourse around the murder of Annie Lay, who many of you recall was a graduate student at Yale University who was murdered by a white lab technician, or, well, he's the only suspect or person of interest in the murder at this point. As a Vietnamese American woman who is also a graduate student, I really did follow the story very closely, and I noticed very different things with regards to public discourse. I noticed that law enforcement and the mainstream media, on the one hand, characterize this only as an example of workplace violence. However, whenever I checked my email, whenever I checked a listserv with Asian American on it, or I looked at a blog focusing on Asian Americans, I heard very different things. A lot of people talked about how Raymond Clark, the suspect, could have had an Asian fetish for Annie, or basically an affinity for Asian American women based on the stereotype of an Asian woman as nothing more than a submissive sexual object who enjoys being victimized and or makes an easy target. So in terms of what I'm going to focus on in my paper, first is public discourse and the reasons for this disconnect. Why did people talk about this incident differently based on their race and based on their gender? First, I go into a discussion of stereotypes of Asian American women and I go more into this definition of Asian fetish. And I talk about the difficulties in discussing these stereotypes as something that's not just a fetish, something that's not just benign or an affinity, but something that is harmful, something that is dangerous and can be characterized as hatred. Second, I look at the political barriers facing Asian American women in organizing against racialized gender-based violence that they experience in their communities. First, I talk about the issue of rhetoric and framing. How do you adopt more strong, unifying language that can carry to another community or the mainstream media? How do you change public discourse? Second, I talk about how Asian American advocacy organizations can play a role in organizing these women, but have not done so. I talk about the work that Asian American advocacy organizations have done around hate crimes and challenge the male-on-male perpetrator-victim model. Third, I discuss structural barriers to advocating for hate crimes prosecutions of intersectional violence. I discuss briefly the evolutions of federal hate crimes legislation and how only recently and unsuccessfully gender-based claims and intersectional claims have been brought as forms of hate violence. Lastly, with regards to coalition building, within the Asian American community and also beyond the Asian American community, I discuss progressive critiques of the Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Specifically, if we're a progressive movement, do we want to be contributing to the expansion of the criminal justice system and the prison industrial complex? Oops, back? Do I go back? Okay, I guess it's not that important. But basically, I want to start with this image of Raymond Clark, the suspect in Annie's murder, because this image provoked very different reactions from Asian Americans. I go to, let's see, first I'll talk about how law enforcement discussed it. So the New Haven police chief said explicitly that this is no more than an instance of workplace violence. In the alternative, the media said, maybe this is an example of campus violence. I mean, you have stabbings at UCLA, you have shootings at Virginia Tech in different schools. Maybe it's that. Maybe we need to put security cameras in all of our hallways and in our labs. But compare this to what some women said about the murder. The chief of Raymond Clark's own union, Laura Smith, came out to say, this is a broader problem of violence against women and a reminder that women everywhere are not safe and that we need to do more to change this. Now, compare this to what Asian Americans said. So this is a posting by Phil Yu, who runs a blog called Angry Asian Man, which is basically a blog that follows pop culture and politics within the Asian American community, focusing mostly on students and young professionals. So basically what he said was, he focused in on Raymond Clark appearing first in his 2004 yearbook as a member of the Asian Awareness Club. He is photographed next to two women of Asian descent. I'm not sure what this means, but I can think of a few things. Big red flags. I mean, it's important to emphasize that we may never know what motivated Clark to murder Annie. What I'm focusing in on is the lack of this opinion, specifically in the mainstream media, and how this tends to never be discussed when you look at the murder of an Asian American woman, specifically by someone who is not of her own race and someone who is a man. Asian American women also weighed in on Annie's murder. Vietnamese American student listservs were basically full of personal accounts of violence against Asian American women. One of the emails that I received definitely, got me thinking about this paper. This student in New Jersey wrote, "I wanted to inform broadcasting stations and newspapers to let them know that Annie's death is more than just workplace violence. It's an act of stereotyping Asian females as small, timid, and easy targets. I say this because it happened to my family as well. In 1978, my sister was raped, sodomized, strangled, murdered, and her body was stuffed in an empty closet apartment of an abandoned building. The person who murdered her was a former Marine who served in Vietnam for a few years. She was 17 when this incident occurred, 3 years after we came to America. My parents did not press any charges because we were too new to this country to know what needed to be done. Also, my parents had repressed this horrific incident in order to go on with their lives and the lives of 3 other teenagers they had to care for as immigrants." So basically, the way that Asian American women discussed this crime was they used language in terms of Asian fetish, they mentioned stereotypes, but one woman in particular, Jaemin Kim, who is a blogger with the Huffington Post and formerly a lawyer with the New York Civil Liberties Union Reproductive Rights Unit, said that these crimes should really be prosecuted as hate crimes, but they never are. If she, as a Korean American woman, were raped on account of her race, then she would want hate crimes charges brought against her attacker. So what are these stereotypes specifically? I'm just going to go into it very briefly. There are a few slides. There are so many slides I could show, but in the interest of time, this is just a very general overview. But in terms of the political barriers, how the way Asian Americans have discussed this crime has not found its way into mainstream discourse, I'm going to look at what the barriers might be and also possible solutions, specifically with regards to the rhetoric employed and also the issue of organizing the community. So in the 85 years between Madame Butterfly, which is an opera by Italian composer Giacomo Puccini, and Miss Saigon, my favorite Broadway musical, is basically the same story. An American soldier goes to Japan or Vietnam, finds a geisha or prostitute who just loves American men, and this man in particular, impregnates her, returns to America, comes back with a white wife, and says, "I want to bring my child to America." And what happens in both cases is the woman, just laments the loss of her man, gives up the child, and kills herself, right, in very traditional fashion. And you can see this also in parallels of discussions of sati in India and things of that nature, just a little bit overblown, right? So the self-sacrificing woman who will always be there for you is one image. And then, let's see, another of my favorites, sorry, this is actually very tame compared to some of the other stuff I found. But this is a scene from Full Metal Jacket. This is basically the first scene you see in Vietnam is a Vietnamese woman coming up to an American soldier, just basically saying, "I'm very horny and I'm going to love you forever." And this is my skirt. So basically you have that. And one thing that a professor here suggested that I do, because other students have done this in the past to kind of illustrate this, is just a Google search of Asian girlfriend. I passed up the recommendation that I show the results from the image search. Actually, you can imagine what came up. It was mostly pornography in terms of what kind of pornography, which varies depending on the identity category of the subject. It was mostly Asian women depicted in very, submissive positions, perhaps bondage type situations, mostly being penetrated by white men. And in terms of just what the website search turned up, you see mostly in the context of dating. And yeah, I mean, in terms of what the dating websites had in store for us, they said, given the increasing number of Asian women worldwide, it's no wonder that many men want to learn how to attract Asian women. We see lots of movies and articles that portray these sexy women as very eager to please their men. Many Caucasian men enjoy the exotic look of Asian women and are quick to seek their company. Many traditional Asian women are accustomed to adopting a more subservient role than their Caucasian counterparts. It's not meant as a derogatory statement, but more of a cultural observation. Therefore, you should make sure to present yourself as a real man who likes to take control. Learning how to attract Asian girls involves making the majority of the decisions and letting her feel that she will be well taken care of, especially during sex. Because an Asian woman is less likely to compete for a dominant role, she will be more likely to appreciate your take charge attitude. So that's basically what we're looking at in sum. Moving on. So basically, how does this become dangerous? I mean, a lot of Asian American women in their posts and blogs and online forums linked Raymond Clark to Michael Lohman, for example, a graduate or a student at Princeton University who stalked dozens of Asian women. He clipped off pieces of their hair when they weren't looking and used them for sexual self-gratification. He slipped semen and urine into their drinks in dining halls. So, I mean, how do you link that up, basically? How do you move from this is just a stereotype to it's something that's very dangerous? Compare this to how Laura Smith, for example, Raymond Clark's union chief, deployed the language of violence against women, right? That's terminology that does carry, right? There's some gravity to it, even if it's still not that well understood by the mainstream public. So what could be helpful to Asian American women is deploying stronger language, calling this instead racialized gender-based violence, for example, and linking it to more concrete examples. 3 other examples that were raised were, say, in Spokane, Washington in 2000, when 2 white men and 1 woman acting on sexual fantasies of Japanese women as submissive abducted, raped, and tortured 5 Japanese exchange students. In LA, a man raped, assaulted, and robbed 13 women who he believed to be Korean. In none of these instances did authorities even consider bringing hate crimes charges. In terms of how to broaden the context, which is really important considering all the examples that I showed you come from, what's the context of interaction between men in the US and men in Europe and women in Asia, it tends to be war and imperialism, especially if you look at countries like India, Japan, China, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia. So that kind of relationship is not necessarily well understood by people here or not necessarily remembered, but Asian Americans tend to recall that. So in the international context, for example, the sex tourism industry in Southeast Asia that attracts mostly men and men from America and Europe. In Cambodia, for example, there are 50,000 Vietnamese girls under the age of 16 that work as sex workers, most of them against their will. There's a huge kidnapping problem in Vietnam, actually. But yeah, so that's just another example of how it's harmful, and it could be useful to bring this up in discussions. But the next issue I turn to is organizing. In none of the examples that I listed of crimes against Asian American women in the US did Asian American advocacy organizations actually step up to denounce these crimes as A, violence against women, or B, racialized gender-based violence against Asian American women or hate violence. Rather, Asian American advocacy organizations have done a significant amount of organizing around male victims of hate crimes, specifically the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin, who was murdered in Detroit by 2 laid-off auto workers because they thought he was Japanese and responsible for taking their jobs. The second is the 1997 murder of Kwan Chun Kao in the Bay Area because police officers thought that he had martial arts capabilities. And the third is the 1999 murder of Joseph Alito by a white supremacist on basically a killing spree. Michael Chang has discussed the importance of having Asian American advocacy organizations take a lead role in organizing against hate violence, specifically their role in changing public discourse by tying in the role of stereotypes. For example, in Kwon Chung Kao's murder, it was tied by the media to just the larger issue of police brutality. But once Asian American organizations stepped up in the Bay Area to say that this is about stereotypes, it really did change the discourse, arguing, I mean, you can't use stereotypes as self-defense to murder, right? So also, it's important in terms of community education. How do you inform the Asian American community about their rights, about what hate violence is, about how to seek, basically, I mean, in terms of direct legal services or social services, how do you seek support when this happens to you or your family, and also to advocate for legislative reform and build long-term coalitions that can actually react instantly to these instances of violence. Okay, I mean, I turn next to structural barriers to basically what Jaemin Kim advocated for, which is hate crimes prosecutions of gender-based violence against Asian American women. So it's actually relatively recent that gender-based violence has been considered as a form of hate violence. The 1969 federal hate crimes law basically just permitted prosecutions on the basis of race. I mean, I'm just talking about it in terms of racialized gender-based violence. But in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act provided the first form of federal redress for gender-based violence outside of the workplace. But as many of you know, it was struck down in Morrison in 2000. The Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009 added gender as a basis of discrimination in terms of hate violence, and also eliminated the requirement that the victim be attempting to engage in a federally protected activity. However, the establishment the requirement of establishing bias still remains, and it's still yet to be seen how this is going to play out in courts. But for example, if in Annie's case the only example that you had of why Raymond Clark might be motivated to kill her on the basis of her race and her gender is his association in an Asian Awareness Club, then you would probably lose. I mean, you wouldn't win this prosecution would not be successful. But also in terms of how federal courts have traditionally treated claims of intersectional violence, if you look at Title VII, not so positively, right? So you have the DeGraff and Reed case. But yeah, moving on, sorry. In terms of, say, if you have Asian American advocacy organizations attempting to build a coalition of support, as they did for Vincent Chin, Joseph Alito, and Kwon Chung Kao, if they wanted to do it, say, in a case like Annie's, then they're going to have to deal with a lot of internal and external progressive critiques that have been leveled at hate crimes legislation. So, in particular, the Asian Law Caucus of San Francisco is unique in the sense that it has a juvenile justice project. And so in terms of the Juvenile Justice Project, they work primarily with youth of color, mostly young men who are incarcerated. But what they argued in terms of the coalition supporting the Hate Crimes Prevention Act was that the criminal justice system usually plays a central role in the subordination of people of color. And what happens is that when you look at prisons in particular, prisons are a major site of violence for people of color, and people of color who are not just people of color, but are poor, are transgendered, and identify as LGBT. So what happens is, their argument is basically, if you incarcerate people who have been convicted of hate crimes with people of color who really have no way to get out, then that really isn't solving your problem. In terms of the other critiques, it's also that the criminal justice system, in terms of prosecutions, has been shown to not actually deter crime, and rather it needs to be more rehabilitative, less punitive, and focus on community education to remedy underlying problems that cause crime. Also, another criticism is the portrayal of hate violence as something that is done by like an individual perpetrator on an individual victim rather than a problem of systemic hatred. So I do think the criticism is very legitimate. In terms of my conclusion, I, at the end of the day, do call for progressive support of Asian American women who do advocate for classifying racialized gender-based violence in their communities as hate violence and something that should be prosecuted under hate crimes legislation. A lot of that is the redeeming value of having a community at the grassroots level, being able to name the violence that is experienced by people in their community, and also defining their own remedies. Also, in terms of accounting for realities of violence against women, hate crimes violence tends to be conceptualized as a very male-on-male often. I hit you, you hit me, if you don't die, we go home. Or, I mean, basically, you know, a man attacks someone who really can't find back, and I mean, that's just the end of it. But in terms of what happens when someone survives, for example, if you look at the domestic violence context, then it's very unlikely that, I mean, if the person is not incarcerated, there's the possibility that the victim will be attacked and will die. I mean, so at some level, the individual does matter. Also, in terms of Asian American women advocating for hate crimes prosecutions, I do think that the support should not be uncritical. There should be a call for rehabilitation. There should be a call for community education and efforts to really change underlying stereotypes that are detrimental to community welfare. But at the same time, to the extent that they can join coalitions to work towards the reduction of the criminal justice system, then that would be a plus.
If we can get our speakers back up here, we have a little bit of time for questions and discussion with all of you in the audience. So give Vic a minute. Questions, comments, connections. Yeah, you can try to talk from there or come up to the mic, whatever you prefer.
So thank you. I'm sorry I came in late and missed the first speaker. I was struck, well, first of all, let me say, I don't know if anybody heard Andrea Smith talk yesterday. Her paper seems very relevant to the two last papers. She separates out the meaning of hate and the meaning of crime and identifies the state as an actor of hate crime. So I think it's really useful. And it's actually provocative for me because of the question. There seems to be a bit of a tension between Liz, your paper, and Jacqueline, is it? Paper. Liz, you seem to be suggesting that we need to turn away from the state, in a sense, right? To move away from international law, because it's not going to help us, right? That's not where the site of change is going to happen. Whereas, Jacqueline, you concluded that we need to have a critical engagement with the state to look at critical ways of prosecuting racialized, gendered hate crimes. So I was wondering if you could perhaps reflect a little bit on, you know, in some ways Liz's point, and Liz to talk about any role is there any role for the state to play in this? So the role of the state, basically. I'm a political scientist. What's the role of the state in this? And then, Liz, you left us with a teaser at the end. Okay, so we need to shift away from international law and think about decolonizing in alternate ways. If you could just flesh that out a little bit, that would be great.
Okay, sure. Thank you for your question. I guess I'll start. In terms of in terms of why hate crimes legislation involved, it did acknowledge a lot of state violence, right? Like the state's central role in terms of either turning a blind eye to hate violence or actively participating in it. And I mean, it really does. When I was going through my research, it's clear that a lot of women do not trust law enforcement and would not report rape or rape as a hate crime, for example, because it's often perpetrated by law enforcement. I think for me, as much as I personally dislike the prison industrial complex and mistrust the criminal justice system, it's not going to be dismantled overnight. And also, at the present, in terms of when I was looking at progressive critiques, they were just very much that. They were just very deconstructivist, and they didn't really offer what I saw as solid alternatives. to say, I mean, I guess in terms of my work experience when I've worked with women in domestic violence settings, it's just, you know, what do you really do when, I mean, the man is incarcerated, he's going to post bond, and the woman is terrified that she's not going to be able to relocate and be able to get away from him before he finds her again, right? And so I think, I think that the criticism of the state is really valid. I do think that people who advocate for hate crimes prosecutions should at the same time really be developing alternatives to prosecutions too. Because at some point also, the reality is, you lock someone up, if they didn't kill the person, odds are they're probably going to be let out at some point. So.
Thanks for your question. How can I, you know, I'm a political scientist too, but not a very good one, I think, disavowing my membership. But my issue, I guess, is not so much to think about legal practitioners and state institutions as much as I'm thinking about and addressing my remarks to feminism and feminists and feminist organizing and feminist analysis. Because I think that, and this goes along with just the theme of the conference of thinking our way through intersectional identity, intersectional positioning, and also seeing the ways that our systems of states, of international law, that all the regimes we have governing global politics are part of a colonial paradigm. And that's not a historical legacy. It's a contemporary manifestation of a colonial paradigm in the way that these laws work. So I can't really speak within, you know, as a practitioner, how we reform law so much as what I'm trying to push is a shift from this idea that, you know, race is separate from gender, and a push away from the idea that colonialism is something that happened a long time ago and doesn't shape how we do things now. Because one of the reasons I went back to thinking about the laws of war in this way and sexual violence is because more recently what I'm working on is the laws of war as it's deployed by the U.S. Military Commissions Act or legislation around torture. Those are all the laws of war, and the reason that we can mess with those laws of around torture is because they presume a racial other. They presume that certain peoples can be legitimately tortured in the name of the prevailing global order, right? So I think it's a bigger project than reforming law, and I think it's a cultural shift that I'm aiming to push here, a cultural shift, a shift in our consciousness about what we think is the cause of inequality and violence against women, for instance, and what we think the role of sexuality is in governance, right? So there's another aspect of it is we take for granted that sexuality should be governed. We take for granted that, you know, states should legitimate marriages and determine under what conditions we have reproductive choices, and we know it's this sort of, this is something we need to take apart. Why is sexuality a matter of public interest? It's amongst the most private, intimate things we do as humans. So there's like lots of angles, right? And it's about a shift in consciousness, I think, that I'm suggesting. And I don't have real big answers to that. Just yes.
Yeah, Carolyn.
I want to, first of all, thank you so much. It was really fantastic, all of the presentations. And I also wanted to say, so I was a little bit to your point, and I'm sorry I don't know anyone's name, but I was an organizer on the U.S.-Mexico border in Arizona when the white supremacy movement kind of came in, and you know, from the Northwest and from Southern California, and sort of started doing all the anti-immigration work down there. And so it was kind of a revelation. I was already doing progressive organizing with like maquiladora workers and ranchers and stuff, and we were like, oh wait, there's a whole new universe. And I got to know intimately David Duke's platform for the presidency, which you're probably familiar with from like the 90s, where he laid out kind of this way to sort of mainstream white supremacy so that folks could get involved without necessarily knowing that they were participating in white supremacy. So anti-immigration, it was three parts. It was anti-immigration work, it was anti-bilingual education, and it was anti-choice for white women. So, and then of course you see that that's kind of a lot of how our public policy and our federal policy has rolled out since then. And so in this very rural county that I was working in, for example, you would see like Rumsfeld come down and meet with them about their unmanned aerial drones technology, which they had brought to the border and that kind of thing, directly with these white supremacist groups that were clearly white supremacist identified. They were coding it slightly but barely, you know, and so they were very much like neo-Nazi affiliated. So I just wanted to say to your point about, you know, colonial history being in the past and not so much that in fact a lot of what we see happening at the federal level around policy right now is really a direct result of that continuation. So, and I'm sorry I don't have a question.
I'll throw out a question. I think with Vec and Liz, you both talked about looking in different countries, different cultures, and also this concept of the other. And I wonder if, you know, maybe you could pick up on that first, Vec. You didn't quite say it that way, but I think it's very similar. And I wonder if you might say something about that, how the ways in which we think about and deal with trans in these different communities ties into this notion of the other and the uncivilized, maybe.
Yeah, I think that is a common tendency. Perhaps by way of example, I'll talk about a previous experience in giving a talk on a context of the US-Mexican border, and I was doing a project that was based on the kinds of conditions that brought about an anti-cross-dressing law within the town Tecate, which is kind of, you know, not too distant, about an hour and a half away from Tijuana, sort of positioned between Tijuana and Mexicali. And it was an ordinance that was brought in 2002 by a particular town council that was in power, which was, you know, of the most conservative stripe, the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which has lost power in the national scene, but still maintains in some state legislatures and in some municipal spaces some influence. And in 2002 that was the case. And I really wanted to resist that notion that, you know, oh, these kinds of atypical laws, indeed anachronistic laws, occur because Mexico is just fundamentally machista and fundamentally homophobic, and, you know, that this is what happens in this country, yeah. And so I started off my talk saying, I started with the assumption that this was not enough and that this was potentially very obscuring, because on the one hand you've got spaces within the Mexican Republic that have, you know, we only have to look at the federal district and we can see that, you know, there's same-sex civil unions and marriage indeed now, right? If you want to go that way. But there's also legislative protections for transgender people and mechanisms in which a certain group of people, if they have the money, of course, you know, there are some conditions to this, but they can change their documentation, their gender documentation. And so it's just, you know, very erroneous to assume that we can just put Mexico all in one box, yeah? And so I was very interested in the local specificities around this case because it seemed atypical, and yet at the same time I felt like it spoke to something about certain kinds of regressive political cultures that were reacting against the progressive elements within other areas of Mexico. So anyway, I was trying to do the dues to the nuances, and, you know, I sort of felt like I could lean on at least some knowledge of, you know, what Tijuana was like, and I was speaking to a partially Latino audience as well, and I thought, I can make a few exceptions here. I'm not, somewhere that's so geographically distant. And someone did a report on my talk and claimed that I'd said that, this was this anti-cross-dressing law was due to the fact that Mexico's machista, and that it's an endemic situation, and that these poor travestis and trans women, some of them have luckily been able to cross the border and get into democracy. It was written by a student, okay, but I was shocked, and then at the same time I thought, how powerful is that kind of binary? If you only have to look at, the work of someone like Pablo Vila, I don't know if many of you might be aware of Pablo Vila's work crossing borders. He works on metaphors, of the way in which, on both sides of the border, people position the Mexicans on the Mexican side of the border. And ironically, sometimes it's Mexican Americans that also see, the landscape of the borderlands, which is extremely variegated, actually. We're talking about lots of different gateways with different kinds of crossings and different kinds of socio-economic conditions and ethnographic kind of makeup. That otherizing, it really reminded me of the way in which that circulates discursively and gets reproduced, and that in spite of my intentions, and in spite of the fact that I felt like I was really hammy, that I was overdoing it, and I thought, maybe I don't need to do this, but it turned out that I needed to do more. And so in spite of all of that, there was a mindset that said, oh, well, this is because Mexico's underdeveloped. This is because Mexico is machista, and that kind of thing. And, we need analyses that keep gender within view. There's no doubt about that. Gender is a structural reality. There's cultural arguments, culturalist arguments. I mean, another person that's really useful to navigate through that and who really worked on sexual migrations and asylum law and the sort of eccentricities and the deeply politicized and inequitable relationships that go on. Someone who unfortunately has passed away now, Leonel Cantu, whose book came out last year, Sexual Migrations, really pulls that culturalist kind of framework apart and the damage that it can do both to individuals who are seeking asylum and also in terms of the way in which the migrational process itself is regulated and the claims that one is expected to make about one's place of origin. And I find that deeply problematic because it doesn't ameliorate local conditions. There are some people who can't get asylum. I've been involved in asylum cases and that don't always work, and we just need to, we need to really think very, very powerfully about, how our forms of understanding those contexts and representing them can be complicit or can work in ways that we don't expect or, can be just frankly not useful. So that's my really long-winded answer. Does that work?
Okay, no. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm sorry I came in late and didn't catch everyone's name either. But I wanted to point out another tension that I found between some of the speakers. And the first and last speaker both spoke about the need to have hate, to recognize hate crimes and to see where race and gender come into play. But then the middle speaker, you spoke about when this goes too far and causes, with the Yugoslavia case, causes us to ignore Serb-on-Serb violence and to assume that the assumption of all sexual relations between ethnicities being problematic. And so when there is a clear, as the first and last speaker pointed out, where there is a clear prejudices that cause hate crime, how do you then strike a balance without then overlooking other crime or assuming, I think, yeah, between the two tensions. Yeah.
Just a clarification. It's not so much my concern is that Serb on Serb violence. I just have a hard time even talking sometimes because these categories are so made up in a way and deployed in certain ways. But it's not so much that certain kinds of violence are ignored as my primary concern. It's more to think about the effects of working through racialized law to seek redress for gender crimes, right? That the international tribunals, they're working on the idea of some kind of intersection. They're not doing that critically, though, right? They're using it in very fixed and concretized ways, that these are fixed identities, and that they can adjudicate on that basis. This is kind of the necessary way that international law works in this context, right? If it's not a nationalist groups or ethnic groups that you can designate as belligerents and victims, then there isn't a place for international law in that story, right? Then that's domestic law, and domestic law is governing violence. So what I'm suggesting is those necessary foundations, necessary legitimating foundations of international law are racialized in ways that have highly problematic consequences, right? That I don't think we can address gender-based violence separate from thinking about the way that race operates and the way that global power operates. Because we're not addressing gender-based violence in every context that it happens. We're not addressing the violence committed by civilized soldiers, right, of civilized nations. And I think that these are all very selective ways of going about making a claim of doing something progressive, but really doing something, I think, quite conservative in conserving the ways that power operates right now. So, yeah, I think that's what I can say. Yeah.
Do you have anything to add?
I guess in terms of just looking at my paper topic and looking at my argument, in terms of just, I mean, being in the critical race studies program and coming to law school to do that, for me, I also see the law as definitely not neutral, right, and not always working in the favor of communities of color. But for me, in terms of any redemptive value that you might be able to find in, say, hate crimes prosecutions, to the extent that it represents an acknowledgement of the role that the state has played in committing violence against subordinated communities, that to the extent that we can redeem a criminal justice system in a way that in a way to actually help our communities, then we should. And also, it's just in terms of whether or not, I mean, for example, in the international law context, I mean, there's a debate as to whether you need a tribunal to really make a community feel like they've received justice, right? Like, do you want to go forward with a tribunal, or do you want to go forward with, say, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And in terms of just looking at my particular project and looking at racialized gender-based violence, I didn't see necessarily, like, I mean, that was a recommendation, I think, by one of the people who criticize hate crimes legislation, that there be truth and reconciliation instead of incarceration. And for me, just looking at the examples that were in my paper, I just didn't see that as a viable solution to what was going on in these circumstances. So I guess that's my answer.
Just as an additional comment, I did use the word hate crime. However, I wasn't necessarily advocating a framework that would, fundamentally understand the forms of violence against travestis as necessarily and ultimately hate crimes. I wanted to complicate the idea that indeed that you could reduce it to one particular kind of axis, like for instance in this case gender, and to a merely individual action. I think in the Latin American contexts that I've been addressing, and only very briefly I know, and if you got the chance to see some of those cases, you would have seen some alarming statistics. You perhaps didn't get really a sense of some of the agents, but the predominant scenario is state violence. That's what it is. Yeah. Whether that's explicitly acknowledged or not, this is what people who are within the communities will tell you. And it's the police, it's the agents of the law, and sometimes it's done under a veil of legality and sometimes not. Sometimes it doesn't matter because people quote laws that don't exist. Yeah? And sometimes, you know, in that very moment, what kind of power do you have? So murders of people are, as I said very briefly, are just the tip of the iceberg. And there's a structural reality to this violence which goes all the way from, you know, the experiences in the street with authorities, but also with health professionals who sometimes work in tandem with the police, you know, subjecting people to forced HIV tests, for instance, rounding people up, street sweeps. And this is also not violence that's only faced by travestis. There is civilian violence, civilian on civilian violence, obviously, and there are forms of violence that aren't only perpetrated by state authorities, and yet it's a very interesting question to try to map the alliances that do occur, especially when you see institutional inaction around certain, you know, repeated cases. The violence might be represented and felt very individually, but the landscape in which it occurs, and murder, for instance, is just one particular consequence of a series. You know, most people, when they report, I'm thinking about a Peruvian study, Realidades Invisibles, Invisible Realities, and they sort of look at three different actors, and one of them is the seres narcos, and that's kind of like the private security forces of the Lima municipality, the capital. And then you've also got a moral majority group, and you've got neo-Nazi gangs, right? Now, they did this study because no one's collecting this data. Yeah? There is no hate crime framework. So I'm not necessarily advocating that. What really I would be advocating is thinking about the various kinds of violence that do occur within these locales in relation to the institutionality. And in this way, it's not out of line with the analysis that's already going on, and I'm not necessarily saying something fundamentally original. But I think that by pointing that out, it helps to rethink what we mean when we say something like transphobia. And if we understand that as fundamentally just associated with gender, or someone's individual gender expression. So I don't know if I'm making that explicit, but the hate crimes kind of push. It can isolate a particular moment, something experienced by a particular individual for hopefully redress, but when we're talking about institutional realities in which nothing is done, you know, where perhaps 28 murders occur and over a 10-year period 2 are investigated, then, you know, what does that mean?
Okay, and on that, I think our time has come to an end, so thank you all for coming, and thanks to our wonderful panelists.